Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at Unhumans, the secret history of communist revolutions and how to crush them.
Oh, interesting.
It's by Jack Posobiec and Joshua Lisec. So if you are into history, politics, and maybe a little bit of strategy, this is going to be right up your alley. This book really takes a deep dive into the patterns of these communist revolutions across history.
Yeah, I've heard about this one. Pretty controversial, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Posobiec and Lisec argue that there is like an actual blueprint for how these movements come about, and they even give some suggestions for how to counter them.
We'll have to get into that.
We will. Later in the deep dive. But it's more than just a history lesson, though. We'll be talking about some real-life stories and examples from the book that I think you'll find fascinating and maybe even a little unsettling.
Sounds like a wild ride.
Oh, it is. So let's start off by introducing our authors, right? Jack Posobiec, he's a former naval intelligence officer.
Okay, so he knows his stuff.
Yeah, which gives him a pretty unique perspective on the world of, intelligence gathering and all that geopolitical strategy.
Right.
And then we have Joshua Lisec. He's a prolific writer and researcher with a deep understanding of history and political philosophy.
So they make a pretty good team then.
Yeah, they do. They combine their expertise in this book to unravel what they see as, well, this threat of communism spreading across the globe.
And right away, the title, Unhumans, that's going to get some attention.
Oh, it definitely does. Definitely raises some eyebrows. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, what's the deal with that?
Well, the authors say they're using this term not to dehumanize anyone, but to describe a very particular mindset.
Okay.
They're talking about individuals driven by this ideology that wants to dismantle the existing social structures, often through violence and coercion.
Ah, I see. So it's a way to, really draw attention to this dangerous ideology.
Right, exactly. It's meant to be provocative and get you thinking critically about the implications of it.
Makes sense.
So the Unhumans they're talking about, they're essentially the ones driving these communist revolutions. They're the ones willing to use any means necessary to reach their goals, even if it means, sacrificing individual rights and freedoms.
Even human lives.
Yes, even human lives.
Yeah.
Now, the book starts off with, get this, an analogy to childhood nightmares.
What? Really?
Yeah, like the universal nightmare of being chased. You know that feeling, right?
Absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, you're being chased by something unknown and you just feel utterly helpless to escape. They connect that feeling to the sense of powerlessness that they think draws people to these communist ideologies in the first place.
Interesting. So, people are looking for answers, and these ideologies offer them a way out?
Exactly. They argue that revolutionaries exploit that vulnerability, that desire for security and belonging, and they promise these solutions that ultimately just lead to more suffering.
A classic bait and switch.
Yes. Preying on those fears and anxieties. And then the authors, they get into the heart of their analysis with the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolution.
Which most people know at least a little bit about.
Yeah, but what Posobiec and Lisec do, they break it down in a way that highlights the underlying patterns and strategies, like the things they think are common to all communist revolutions.
Okay, I'm starting to see where they're going with this.
Yeah, so they delve into how Lenin, who was a master strategist, by the way, and propagandist, how he really took advantage of the issues people were having in society. He was promising peace, land, and bread to a population that was tired of war and poverty.
But those promises, they didn't really pan out, did they?
Not at all. The Bolsheviks came to power and, as we know, unleashed a reign of terror. Millions died. And to really paint that picture, the authors bring in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago.
Oh, wow, that's a heavy one.
It's a brutal account of life in the Soviet Gulag system. And it's a reminder of how these communist systems often they shut down any disagreement. They suppress freedom and create this culture of fear where everyone's under the thumb of the state.
Yeah, so Solzhenitsyn's work is like this really powerful indictment of the human cost of this ideology.
Exactly. It shows the hypocrisy of a system that says it champions the working class, but then turns around and oppresses and exploits them.
Right. All in the name of the revolution.
And this is where the book starts to get even more, well, let's say controversial.
Because they start connecting it to things that are happening today.
Yeah, they draw parallels between the rhetoric and tactics of some modern social and political movements and what they call this communist playbook.
They're saying these movements are using the same strategies that communists have used throughout history.
Yeah, and they argue that these movements are exploiting the same feelings of, oppression and resentment to create division and really undermine the norms of society.
Hmm. I see. So like events like, I don't know, the death of George Floyd or movements like defund the police.
Exactly. They even talk about the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ, in Seattle.
Right, right.
And they're not necessarily saying that everyone involved in these movements is a communist or anything like that.
But rather that the tactics and the goals are, in a lot of ways, similar to what communists have used throughout history.
Right. And it's a thought-provoking argument, for sure. It leads into their analysis of propaganda and what they call coding.
Coding? What do they mean by that?
Well, they argue that years and years of being exposed to certain narratives in the media, in school, even pop culture, can really shape how we see things and make us vulnerable to certain ideologies.
So we've been conditioned to see the world in a certain way, maybe without even realizing it?
Exactly. They use this term coding to describe that subtle influence on our beliefs and values.
It's like we've been programmed to interpret events in a certain way, even if it's not accurate.
Right. They say this coding can make us more likely to believe certain things, even if they're based on, I don't know, flawed logic or even lies, and that we don't question it because it fits our existing beliefs.
That's pretty scary when you think about it.
It is. They even argue that this coding is often deliberate, a way to manipulate public opinion and make it easier to accept certain ideas while others get dismissed or demonized.
Are there any examples of that?
Yeah, they talk about the Covington Catholic High School student, Nick Sandman, and how his interaction with that Native American activist was initially presented in a certain light, but then later revealed to be much more complex.
I remember that. It was all over the news.
Right, so it's a perfect example of how easily we can be misled. And then that leads us to one of the most insightful parts of the book, the concept of communist operational preparation of the environment.
That's a mouthful. What is that, OPE?
OPE, yeah. It's actually a military strategy used by special forces.
Okay, so like preparing the battlefield before
Right.
you attack.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the authors say that communist revolutions actually follow a similar three-stage OPE, but in the world of ideas and society.
I see. It's a way to understand how these revolutions actually take root and then eventually overthrow the existing power structures.
Right, so let's break down those stages one by one. The first stage, they call it the separation.
Okay, what's that about?
It's all about dividing society, highlighting those differences, maybe they're real, maybe they're just perceived, and creating this us versus them mentality.
So like exploiting existing divisions, whether it's based on race or class or whatever.
Yeah, to sow discord and undermine social cohesion, creating an environment where people see each other as enemies instead of fellow citizens.
It's like breaking society apart, making people more likely to fall for these radical ideas.
Exactly, ideas that promise to solve their problems and make them feel like they belong again, even if those promises are empty. Then we have the second stage, the message.
Which is where the propaganda kicks in, I imagine.
You got it. It's all about crafting this narrative that makes the oppressors look evil and the oppressed look like the good guys. It justifies radical change.
Even violence.
Right, it makes people feel like the revolution is not only necessary, but it's inevitable, like it has to happen.
So they're essentially creating a story, a myth, that people can get emotionally invested in.
Exactly, it taps into their emotions and bypasses critical thinking. And then finally you have the third stage, the infiltration.
Okay, so what happens in this stage?
This is where they start taking control strategically of key institutions. Think media, education, government.
So gaining influence from within, slowly shifting the balance of power.
Right. It's about subtly shaping the narrative to favor the revolution's agenda. They use examples like the Russian Revolution to show how it works. The Bolsheviks, they infiltrated those worker councils and military units.
It's a patient game, playing the long game to exploit vulnerabilities and push their agenda forward.
And once they control those institutions, they control the narrative, they control information, and eventually they consolidate their power. And they go deep on those specific revolutions, using that three-stage OPE framework. It's not just a retelling of events.
They want to explain why things happened the way they did, finding these patterns.
And they don't just focus on the famous revolutions. They dig into some lesser-known uprisings and historical periods, too. Like, they start by going all the way back to ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome, that seems pretty far back.
I know, right? But they analyze the fall of the Roman Republic, saying it holds some important lessons for us today. They point out the huge gap between rich and poor in the late Roman Republic.
Like a small elite controlling all the resources while most people were just struggling to survive.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they connect that economic inequality to the rise of populism and the weakening of traditional institutions.
Sound familiar.
Right, and they argue that this inequality created the perfect conditions for unrest and ultimately played a role in the Republic's collapse.
So they're drawing parallels between ancient Rome and what's happening in Western societies today.
Exactly. They're suggesting that when you have so much wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few, it can lead to revolution.
It creates resentment, makes things unstable, and opens the door for radical ideologies. The ones that promise to redistribute wealth and power, even if it's all a lie.
Right. And they use this term purging to talk about how revolutionaries get rid of their opponents and solidify their grip on power.
And they back this up with quotes from the Communist Manifesto.
They do. You know, those passages about overthrowing the bourgeoisie and creating a classless society. But as we've seen throughout history, these revolutions usually just end up replacing one elite with another, a new set of rulers who are just as bad, if not worse.
It's the classic problem of power corrupting.
And it really exposes the flaws in these utopian ideologies, the belief that you can create a perfect society through force.
By getting rid of anyone who disagrees with you, a prime example they discuss is the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution.
Yeah, those mass executions orchestrated by Robespierre and the Jacobins. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly ideals can turn into fanaticism.
A real cautionary tale about the dangers of mob rule and the seductive power of ideology.
And the authors don't hold back on the details. They talk about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette being executed and the countless others sent to the guillotine.
It's a reminder that revolutions are messy and often brutal.
They also point out the irony of it all. The French Revolution ended up making way for Napoleon. He presented himself as a champion of the revolution.
But then he crowned himself emperor.
Right. And brought back many of the institutions that the revolution was supposed to get rid of.
It really shows how these events can have unintended consequences, how the desire for power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned movements.
And the book goes into some lesser-known revolutions, too, like the Haitian Revolution, the slave uprising.
The one that led to Haiti becoming the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere.
That's the one. It's often celebrated, but the authors present a more nuanced perspective.
What do they focus on?
They talk about the violence, the massacres of white colonists, and the revenge that followed. They acknowledge the horrors of slavery, but argue that the revolution turned into a bloodbath that consumed everyone.
It's a tragic example of how quickly things can spiral out of control.
And how easily violence can become the answer on both sides. It's relevant today when you see similar dynamics and conflicts happening around the world.
Makes you wonder if there's ever a truly clean revolution.
Right. And then they get into the Spanish Civil War, which was obviously a very complex and bloody conflict.
A kind of preview to World War II in a lot of ways.
And they offer a very different take on it. They actually portray Franco, the nationalist leader, as a defender of Western civilization.
Against communism.
Exactly. They argue that the Spanish Civil War was a fight between Christian values and communist ideology, a battle for the soul of Spain and maybe even Europe. They highlight the terrible things that the Republican forces did, the persecution of Catholics, the attacks on churches.
And they take issue with how some writers romanticize the war.
Yeah, they criticize Hemingway and Orwell, who were sympathetic to the Republican side. They say that this romantic view ignores how brutal the conflict really was.
And the true danger of communism.
Right. And from there, they move on to the Chinese Revolution.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Which was obviously a momentous event in world history.
Mao Zedong and the communists coming to power.
They talk about Mao's rise to power, his strategic brilliance, but also his ruthlessness. The Long March, the Cultural Revolution. They argue that Mao was a master manipulator.
Someone who used chaos and suffering to his advantage.
Exactly. And they point out how devastating his policies were, things like the Great Leap Forward and the famine that followed.
Millions of people died.
It's a tragic example of how these utopian visions can go so wrong. Then they shift gears and talk about the 1960s in America, such a turbulent decade.
The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, so much change happening.
And they argue that it was a period of cultural revolution in America.
With all those protests and social movements challenging traditional values.
Exactly. They talk about the urban riots, groups like the Weather Underground, the influence of leftist ideology in universities, and the media. They believe that a lot of the divisions we see in America today have their roots in the 1960s.
Like those seeds were planted back then.
They also bring up the Moynihan Report, which analyzed the problems within the black family structure. They connect those problems to policies like welfare.
So even policies that are meant to help can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Right. And they argue that the 1960s left America more divided and fragmented. Then they revisit Senator Joseph McCarthy.
The guy who led the hunt for communists in the 1950s.
Yep. He's usually portrayed as a villain, but the authors present a more sympathetic view.
They say that he was actually right about the communist threat.
Yeah, even if his methods were questionable. They argue that he was unfairly attacked for trying to protect America. They point to things like the Venona intercepts, which show that there really was Soviet espionage going on.
It's a different way of looking at that period of history.
And then the book moves on to Latin America, focusing on several revolutions and political upheavals, starting with the Cuban Revolution.
Fidel Castro.
They describe how he went from this popular revolutionary figure to a dictator. They talk about how he aligned himself with the Soviet Union, imposed communism on Cuba, and the consequences of that.
The economic problems, the suppression of any opposition, people fleeing the country.
Yeah. They also discuss Che Guevara. They argue that he was more interested in violence and chaos than in building a better world.
Not exactly the romantic figure he's often made out to be.
Right. Then they move on to Chile and the socialist government of Salvador Allende, which was overthrown in a military coup led by Augusto Pinochet.
Another controversial figure.
They actually present a somewhat positive view of Pinochet, arguing that he saved Chile from communism, but they acknowledge that he was an authoritarian leader and that his methods were often brutal.
So a mixed legacy.
Yeah, they highlight the economic reforms he put in place, but also the human rights abuses that happens under his rule. And then they look at the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua.
The one that overthrew the Somoza dictatorship.
They describe how the Sandinistas, a leftist guerrilla group, came to power with support from Cuba and the Soviet Union. And they argue that the Sandinistas were communists from the very beginning.
With the goal of creating a communist state in Nicaragua.
They point out how the Sandinistas made all these promises about social justice and democracy, but then turned authoritarian once they were in control.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And they also talk about the Contra War, the U.S. effort to support the rebels fighting against the Sandinistas. They argue that U.S. involvement was justified.
Stop the spread of communism in Central America.
Exactly. So their analysis of all these revolutions in Latin America really reinforces their overall argument about the dangers of communism. And then the book turns to Africa, specifically apartheid in South Africa.
A horrific system of racial segregation.
They talk about the struggle against apartheid, Nelson Mandela's imprisonment, and the eventual transition to a multiracial democracy.
Which was a huge achievement.
It was. But they also raise concerns about some of the leaders who've come to power since then. They worry that these leaders are embracing some of the same divisive tactics that were used during apartheid.
Like they're stirring up racial tensions for their own political gain.
Yeah. They point to Julius Malema, a leader who's been calling for taking land from white South Africans.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
They argue that his rhetoric is dangerous and threatens to undo a lot of the progress that's been made. And then they bring us back to the U.S. and their analysis of the January 6th Capitol riot.
Which was a really shocking event.
It was. And their take on it is pretty controversial. They call it an inverse Bastille. They're suggesting that conservatives were intentionally led into a trap that day, that the whole thing was orchestrated to make them look bad and discredit them.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is. And they point to the way the government cracked down on the people involved, the arrests, the prosecutions.
They're saying it was an overreaction.
They argue that it shows how the government is willing to use its power against anyone it sees as a threat, especially if they challenge the established order.
Makes you wonder who's really in control.
And they connect this back to their main argument about communism. They say that communist tactics have evolved. Instead of these big violent revolutions, they're now using more subtle and insidious methods to undermine our institutions and values.
So things like cancel culture, online shaming, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. They argue that these tactics are designed to silence dissent and create a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak out against the prevailing narrative.
That's pretty scary when you think about it.
It is. And that brings us to their final section, where they offer 3 strategies for fighting back against these new forms of revolution. They say that these strategies are drawn from history, but are still relevant today.
Okay, I'm curious, what are these strategies?
Well, their first strategy is find the great men of history.
Great men. Like, what do they mean by that?
They say we need to find and support strong leaders who are willing to stand up to the threat of communism and defend Western civilization. Leaders who embody courage, wisdom, and decisiveness. They point to figures like Julius Caesar, Napoleon, even Franco and Chiang Kai-shek as examples.
So they're not saying these leaders have to be perfect, just that they have to be willing to act decisively.
Yeah, and they acknowledge that these figures were flawed, but they say they had the qualities necessary to lead in times of crisis.
So it's a call for strong, decisive leadership. What's their second strategy?
Their second strategy is reciprocity. This one's definitely the most controversial. They're basically saying, you got to fight fire with fire.
Meaning?
If the other side is using underhanded tactics, like lawfare or cancel culture, we need to be ready to use those same tools to defend ourselves.
Wow, that's a bold statement. Aren't they worried about, stooping to their level?
They argue that when you're facing an enemy that's willing to do anything to win, you can't afford to be naive.
So it's like they're saying we need to be willing to play the game even if we don't like the rules. What about their third strategy?
Their third strategy is win before fighting. This one's about being proactive, about building a society that's resistant to these revolutionary ideas from the start.
So like strengthening our institutions, promoting traditional values.
Exactly. They talk about the importance of social cohesion, shared values, a sense of belonging. They think that a strong, united society is less likely to fall for these revolutionary ideas.
It's like building up a defense system against these ideologies.
Right. And they also emphasize the importance of education, not just teaching history, but teaching kids how to think critically and how to spot misinformation, giving them the tools to resist manipulation. So those are their three strategies. Find the great men of history, reciprocity, and win before fighting.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. And the authors don't pretend to have all the answers. They just want to start a conversation, get people thinking and debating these ideas.
It really is. There's so much more to uncover in this book. I mean, it's full of historical examples, arguments, even practical strategies.
And that's what makes it such an interesting read. It's not just a history lesson. It feels like a call to action.
They want us to be ready, aware of the threats, knowing the tactics, prepared to push back and defend our way of life.
Right. And the authors don't pretend to have all the answers, They acknowledge that these are complex issues and there's no easy solution.
But they're trying to start a conversation, encourage people to think critically about these threats, and figure out ways to respond.
Exactly. And while a lot of what we've talked about today might seem kind of dark and pessimistic, the authors do end the book on a hopeful note.
Oh, they do. That's good.
Yeah. They genuinely believe that if we understand the threat, recognize the patterns, and are willing to learn from history, we can overcome these challenges. They believe in the resilience of human beings, the power of good ideas to triumph over bad ones, and the enduring appeal of freedom. They think that if we are willing to fight for what we believe in, we can preserve those things for future generations.
That's a good message to end on.
Well, that's all the time we have for our deep dive into Unhumans, the secret history of communist revolutions and how to crush them. It's a dense and thought-provoking book, and even if you don't agree with everything Posobiec and Lisec say, I think it's worth grappling with their ideas.
It definitely challenges us to think about history, ideology, and the forces that shape our world.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this deep dive has inspired some of you to read the book for yourselves and form your own opinions. Whether you agree with the authors or not, it's a book that will make you think, question your assumptions, and maybe even spark some lively debates with your friends and family. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.